Rain across Blackwater Harbour, Episode 2. Part 2. The Tide Road. The rain continued through the night, not heavy now, but steady enough that Blackwater Harbour seemed wrapped inside its own small weather system, separated from the rest of the world by mist, tidewater and darkness. Elias Mercer did not sleep much. He sat beside the window in the upstairs room with the lamp turned low and listened to the harbour breathing below him. The incoming tide moved beneath the quay with soft, hollow sounds, as though the sea itself were speaking quietly under the boards. Somewhere in the distance, rigging knocked against a mast with slow, irregular taps. And every so often, faintly through the rain, came the bell. One note, then silence. Near midnight, Elias finally rose, pulled on his coat once more, and stepped back into the wet streets. Blackwater Harbour had changed. By day, even in rain, the harbour still belonged to ordinary things. Deliveries, fishing boats, voices from doorways, gulls circling the market sheds. But after midnight, the town became something older. The lanes narrowed. Shadows deepened beneath the lamps. Windows went dark one by one until only the harbour lights remained, reflected in the moving black water. Elias walked alone towards Grey Wharf. The tide was near its highest point now, covering the lower stone steps and creeping beneath the timber platforms. Water slapped softly against the pilings below. The amber light still burned in the upper window of the sailmaker's loft. But tonight there was another light too, farther out, low upon the water, the lantern boat. Elias stopped beside a stack of crab pots and watched. The small vessel drifted between the anchored fishing boats with impossible quietness. No engine sound, no splash of oars, only the faint amber glow at its bow. The boat seemed less to travel than to glide with the tide itself. Elias stepped onto Grey Wharf. The boards groaned faintly under his boots. Rainwater dripped from the roof lines. Somewhere nearby, a loose metal hook tapped against wood in the wind. The lantern boat moved slowly past the end of the wharf, no more than 30 feet away now. He could just make out the outline of a man standing at its stern. Tall, still, wearing a long, dark coat. "Hello," Elias called. The figure did not answer. The boat continued drifting. Elias moved further along the wharf, closer to the water's edge. "Can you hear me?" The figure turned slightly then. Not fully, just enough for Elias to see the pale shape of a face beneath the brim of a cap. Then the harbour bell rang. Once. The sound rolled sharply across the water. At that exact moment, the lantern on the boat went out. The darkness swallowed the vessel almost instantly. Elias heard the faint creak of timber somewhere below the wharf, but when he reached the edge and looked down, there was nothing there. Only black tide water sliding between the pilings. Behind him, a voice said quietly, "You shouldn't follow it." Elias turned. Old Martin Vale stood beneath the awning of the abandoned chandlery, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. Martin had once worked the harbour boats before age, and arthritis drove him ashore. He lived alone now in a cottage near the eastern breakwater, and rarely spoke to anyone longer than necessary. "You were watching me," Elias said. Martin ignored that. "You saw the lantern?" "Yes." The old man nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something unpleasant but unsurprising. "It started again then." "What has?" Martin looked towards the dark water. "The tide road." Rain hissed softly across the harbour. Elias waited. Old harbour men often spoke indirectly, as though facts had to be approached from the side rather than head-on. "At very low tide," Martin said at last, "there used to be a stone path beyond Grey Wharf, long before the newer harbour walls were built. You can still see bits of it on certain mornings." The path out to the old beacon. Martin glanced at him. "So you know about it?" "A little. Not enough." The old man stepped closer beneath the weak yellow lamp. "Before the war, boats vanished out there every few years. Nothing dramatic. No storms, no wreckage. Just gone. Folk blamed fog, or drink, or bad currents." He lowered his voice slightly. "But some of the older ones used to say the lantern called them." Elias said nothing. Martin looked towards the sailmaker's loft. "That building belonged to Jonah Rake once." The name stirred something faintly familiar in Elias's memory. "Sailmaker? And harbour keeper before that. Lived alone upstairs. Strange old devil. Kept records of the tides, bells, ship movements, weather patterns." Martin paused. "Then one winter he disappeared." "The boatman with the lantern?" "No body was ever found." Rainwater trickled along the edge of the wharf between them. "And Arthur Venn?" Elias asked. "How does he fit into this?" Martin's face tightened slightly. Arthur knew more than he admitted. About what? The loft, the bell, the lantern. The old man looked back at Elias carefully. "You should ask yourself why he kept that key all those years." Before Elias could answer, Martin stepped away from the awning. "I'm too old for harbour stories now," he muttered. "Best leave the dead where they belong." Then he disappeared into the rain. Elias remained alone on Grey Wharf, listening to the water beneath the boards. The amber light still glowed upstairs in the sailmaker's loft, but now it seemed different somehow, closer, as though someone stood behind the glass watching him. The following morning brought low cloud, drifting fog, and calmer rain. Blackwater Harbour looked exhausted. Water dripped from every railing and rooftop. Gulls perched silently on chimney pots. The sea beyond the breakwater had become a sheet of dull silver beneath the sky. Elias met Clara Venn outside the old chandlery shortly after 9. She looked tired. "I hardly slept," she admitted. "You're not alone." She unlocked the chandlery door and led him inside. The shop smelled of damp wood, old paper, rope fibres and dust. Shelves still held rusted hooks, chipped lanterns, navigation charts, and cloudy glass bottles of oil. It felt less abandoned than paused, as though Arthur Venn might return at any moment and continue serving customers from 50 years earlier. "You found more notebooks?" Elias asked. Clara nodded. "In the back office." She led him through a curtain into a cramped little room overlooking the harbour. Stacks of ledgers covered the desk. Several notebooks lay open beside an old green-shaded lamp. Elias picked one up carefully. Most pages contained ordinary business entries: lamp oil, 4 tins, net hooks, 12 rope, repair for Harker boat. But later entries changed. The handwriting grew uneven, fragmented. "Tides wrong again tonight, bell before midnight. Saw light moving under the fog. Not a boat. Not entirely." Elias turned another page. Jonah was right about the mirror. Only visible in rain light. "Do not answer knocks after low tide." Clara watched him closely. "He became frightened," she said quietly. "Yes. There's more." She handed him a folded harbour map. At first it appeared ordinary enough. The quay, warehouses, moorings, outer breakwater. But along the eastern edge, beyond Grey Wharf, Arthur had marked a faint dotted line leading out into the tidal flats. Beside it he had written, "The Old Road." Elias looked up. "That path Martin mentioned. You spoke to Martin Vale?" "Last night?" Clara hesitated. "My uncle wrote about him too." She opened another notebook and pointed to a sentence near the bottom of the page. Martin heard the third bell, would not speak of what he saw. Outside, a gull cried somewhere over the harbour. Elias studied the dotted line on the map again. "At very low tide," he murmured. "What?" "The road only appears at very low water." Clara looked uneasy. "You're thinking of going out there?" "I'm thinking Arthur Venn spent years trying to warn someone about it." "And Jonah Rake disappeared there?" "Yes." Rain tapped gently against the office window. Then both of them heard it. 3 knocks. Not at the front door. From upstairs. Clara froze. The knocks came again. Slow. Measured. 3 exactly. Elias stood immediately. "There's no one else here?" he asked. "No." The third set of knocks sounded above them. The upper floor of the chandlery had once been Arthur Venn's living quarters. Clara had told Elias she had not yet gone through most of the rooms. Now the entire building seemed to hold its breath around them. Elias picked up the old brass torch from the desk. "Stay behind me." The staircase groaned beneath their feet as they climbed. Dust hung in the air upstairs. The corridor was narrow, lined with framed harbour photographs gone pale with age. Rain whispered softly against the slanted roof. The final room at the end of the corridor stood partly open. Elias approached slowly. The smell reached him first. Salt water, strong and fresh, as though the sea itself had somehow entered the room. He pushed the door wider. Arthur Venn's bedroom lay untouched. A neatly made bed, a wardrobe, a small clock stopped at 12:14, and beside the window stood an old sea chest with wet footprints leading to it across the dusty floorboards. Clara whispered behind him, "They weren't there yesterday." The footprints were fresh, not puddles exactly, more like marks left by damp boots recently worn ashore. Elias crossed the room carefully. 3 knocks sounded again, this time from inside the sea chest. Clara gasped. The knocks stopped. Silence filled the room except for rain on the roof. Elias crouched beside the chest. The brass lock had already been opened long ago. Slowly he lifted the lid. Inside lay only 3 things: a folded oilskin coat, an old harbour lantern, and a logbook bound in black leather. Nothing else. No hidden compartment, no person, no explanation for the knocking. Yet the inside of the chest smelled strongly of seawater, cold and immediate, as though it had only just been pulled from the harbour itself. Elias lifted the lantern carefully. Its glass was amber-coloured, the same amber glow as the light in the loft window. Clara stared at it. "That's the lantern?" she whispered. Elias turned it over in his hands. Engraved faintly into the brass base were 2 words nearly worn away by age. J. Rake. Outside the harbour bell rang once more. This time both of them flinched. Because the sound did not come from the harbour. It came from downstairs, inside the chandlery. Rain across Blackwater Harbour. Episode 2, Part 3. Beneath the Tide Road. The bell rang again from somewhere below the chandlery. 1 hollow note, then silence. Elias and Clara remained frozen beside the sea chest, listening. Rain whispered over the roof slates. Water dripped somewhere inside the walls. The old house settled with small wooden creaks like a ship at anchor. Then came footsteps, slow, heavy, crossing the shop floor downstairs. Clara's voice was barely audible. "There's someone in the building." Elias set the lantern carefully on the bed and moved towards the corridor. The brass torch in his hand cast a narrow beam across the faded wallpaper and framed photographs. Another footstep sounded below, not hurried, deliberate, as though whoever it was knew the building well. Elias descended the staircase first. Each stair groaned beneath his weight. Halfway down he stopped and listened again. Nothing. The chandlery below stood dim and grey beneath the cloudy daylight filtering through the front windows. Dust floated in the air. Rows of old hooks and lanterns hung motionless. The front door was still locked, but water glistened across the floorboards near the counter. A trail, fresh sea water. Elias stepped into the shop. The wet footprints crossed between the shelves and disappeared behind the rear curtain leading into Arthur Venn's office. Clara stayed close behind him. "You see them?" "Yes." The footprints were larger than before, deep impressions left by heavy boots. Yet there were no returning prints, only the ones leading inward. Elias pulled aside the curtain. The office was empty. The small desk stood where they had left it. Arthur's notebooks remained open beneath the green-shaded lamp. Rain streaked the harbour window beyond. But the room felt colder now, colder than the rest of the building. Clara rubbed her arms. "It's freezing." Elias noticed something else. One of the notebooks had moved. When they left the office earlier, it had lain closed near the edge of the desk. Now it stood open at the center. A page had been marked with a piece of blue cord. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Then Elias stepped forward and read the page. "If the lantern returns before the tide turns, do not follow it onto the road. The sea gives the path only briefly. After the bell, it belongs to them." Below the entry was a rough sketch. Not a map this time. A row of stone markers leading out across dark water towards a tiny square building at the edge of the flats. Clara leaned closer. "What is that?" Elias looked carefully. "A beacon house," he said quietly. "Out there, possibly before the newer lighthouse was built." He turned another page. More fragmented notes filled the margins. Jonah waited for the third bell. Mirror showed the way. Not all who returned were alive when they came back. The room seemed even colder after reading that. Outside the window the harbour fog thickened, drifting slowly between the buildings and masts, until Blackwater Harbour appeared half submerged in cloud. Clara looked uneasy. "My uncle believed all this?" "I think your uncle was trying to understand it." "And you?" Elias closed the notebook carefully. "I think something frightened him badly enough that he kept these records hidden for years." A dull sound interrupted them then. Not a bell this time. A knock. 3 slow knocks against the front door of the chandlery. Clara jumped. Elias crossed the shop quickly and unlocked the door. Old Martin Vale stood outside in the fog, water dripping from his coat collar. "You should close the harbour shutters tonight," he said immediately. "Why?" Martin glanced nervously towards the water. "Tide's wrong." "That's not an answer." The old man stepped inside reluctantly. "The sea's coming in too fast. Harbour masters noticed it already." He lowered his voice. "And the fog's arriving before evening." Clara exchanged a glance with Elias. Martin noticed the notebook on the counter. "You found Arthur's journals." "Yes." Martin stared at them with visible discomfort. "He should have burned those." "Why?" "Because some things around this harbour wake easier if folk keep remembering them." Rainwater dripped from the brim of his hat onto the floorboards. Elias studied him carefully. "You knew Jonah Rake, didn't you?" The old man's face tightened. "When I was a boy." "What happened to him?" Martin did not answer immediately. Finally he said, "One winter night he rowed out beyond Grey Wharf after the bell sounded." His eyes remained fixed on the floor. "Said he'd seen a light on the old road." "And?" "He never came back." "But the boat did?" Martin nodded once. 3 days later, drifted into the shallows. with the lantern still burning. The shop fell silent except for rain on glass. Clara spoke softly. "The lantern from the chest." "Yes," Martin said. He looked suddenly exhausted. Arthur spent years trying to prove there was a rational explanation. Hidden smugglers, maybe. Tide tricks. Reflections in fog. Martin shook his head slowly, but he stopped talking about it after he saw the mirror. Elias looked up sharply. "You knew about that?" Martin gave a humorless smile. "Everyone who gets involved eventually finds the mirror." Outside, somewhere deep in the fog, a horn sounded from the sea. Low, mournful. Not a modern ship horn. Older somehow. The three of them turned instinctively towards the harbour window. Nothing was visible now beyond the nearest few boats. The fog had swallowed everything else. Martin muttered quietly, "It's too early." For what? The tide rode. Then he left abruptly, pulling his coat tighter around himself as he vanished into the grey harbour mist. By late afternoon, Blackwater Harbour had almost disappeared entirely beneath fog. The rain eased, but visibility worsened. Boat masts loomed like thin black poles from the whiteness. Lamps glowed dimly only a few yards away before dissolving into haze. Even the gulls had gone silent. Elias stood at his upstairs window, watching the harbour vanish inch by inch. Someone knocked softly behind him. Clara entered carrying 2 mugs of tea. "Mrs. Vale insisted," she said. That usually means refusing would offend her. Clara smiled faintly for the first time since arriving in Blackwater Harbour. Then her expression faded again. "You're thinking about tonight?" "Yes." "You still intend to go to the Tide Road?" Elias accepted the tea. "I intend to see whether it exists. And if it does, that depends what else appears with it." The room darkened slightly as fog thickened against the window. Clara sat opposite him. "There's something I haven't told you." Elias waited. "My uncle wrote me a letter before he died." She reached into her coat pocket slowly. "I only opened it after the funeral." She handed him the folded paper. The handwriting was shaky. "If the lantern appears again, find Elias Mercer. Do not trust the harbour after midnight. And whatever happens, do not let the bell ring 3 times unanswered." Elias read the final sentence twice. "What does that mean?" Clara asked quietly. "I don't know." But he suspected Arthur Venn had known exactly what it meant. The harbour clock struck 6 somewhere beyond the fog. Almost immediately afterwards came the bell. 1 note. Close now. Very close. Clara stood. That sounded outside the house. Elias crossed to the window. At first he saw nothing except fog and blurred lamplight. Then a shape emerged below. the lantern boat, drifting silently past the quay, closer than ever before. The amber lantern at its bow glowed warmly against the white fog, casting long ripples across the black water, and this time the figure aboard looked directly up at Elias's window. Even through mist and darkness, Elias felt certain of one thing. The man on the boat was wearing an old harbour-keeper's coat, the same coat hanging inside Arthur Venn's sea chest. The bell sounded again, 2 notes now. The boat continued moving towards Grey Wharf. Then, slowly, another sound reached them through the fog. Not water, not rain. Footsteps, many footsteps, from somewhere beyond the harbour wall, as though people were walking together across wet stone, far out beneath the mist. Clara whispered, "There's no path out there at high tide." Elias did not answer, because through a gap in the fog he had just seen something impossible. Far beyond Grey Wharf, where only open water should have been, a line of dark stone markers stretched across the harbour flats, and along that hidden road, moving slowly through the mist towards Blackwater Harbour, came several figures carrying lanterns.